Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Since the last video received a lot of likes and comments, I decided that for this one I should... Right. The working of a wheelbase can be broken down into 4 steps: input, processing, correction, and output. And this entire loop takes as little as 0.1 milliseconds. Let's talk about exactly what happens in that time. I'm approaching a corner and I turn the steering. The game processes it, the car reacts, and in return, the game sends out a torque command. Now this command goes to the wheelbase's firmware, which lives inside the microcontroller on the PCB. Usually something like an STM32 or similar ARM-based chip. The firmware receives the torque request, decides how to apply it, like how fast or how smooth, while constantly keeping a check for any of the filters that you might be using, like damping, inertia, or friction. Now this is where the importance of the firmware comes into play. It can make or break the experience. It is responsible for filtering out any noisy inputs, reducing any oscillations, and by that I mean the dumb ones, and processing everything fast enough that you never notice a delay. Like I have always said, the software is only as good as the hardware it runs on. A brilliant firmware won't magically make a subpar hardware flagship level. It never works out that way. It can help, but only to a certain point. Both hardware and software are equally important. They are two sides of the same coin, or in this case, two sides of the same lap time. And that's the reason why a manufacturer should never skimp on either one of these. Now, back to the topic at hand. Once the firmware has done its job, the process torque command is handed over to the motor controller, the part of firmware that decides how to drive the motor. It calculates the exact 3-phase current needed to generate that torque, but it does not send current directly. Instead, it generates PWM signals, or pulse width modulation signal. These are high-speed on and off voltage pulses. Think of it like flicking a switch on and off thousands of times per second. The longer it stays on in each cycle, the more power is delivered. These signals are sent over to the motor driver, usually made of MOSFET arranged in a 3-phase bridge. Think of MOSFETs as super fast electrical valves. The PWM tells them when to open, for how long, and in what sequence. And they switch on and off thousands of times per second to precisely control the current delivery. Why 3-phase, you might be asking? Because brushless motor runs on 3-phase AC, labeled U, W, and V. Each phase offset by 120 degrees. That creates a rotating magnetic field which smoothly and efficiently spins the rotor. So when the motor controller receives the torque command, it starts the entire chain. PWM signals, MOSFET switching, precise control flow, all working together to push the motor into motion and make the shaft spin. But the motor controller doing its job is only one side of the equation. The other side is encoder, mounted directly to the motor shaft, which constantly reports the rotor's position back to the microcontroller. There are different types of encoders: optical, magnetic, capacitive, but what matters is their resolution, usually measured in bits. The higher the resolution, the more precisely it can detect the movement of the rotor across one full 360-degree rotation. 15-bit encoders detect the movement of rotor in 32,768 different points. 18-bit does that in 262,144 points. 23-bit in over 8 million points. This is the level of precision a wheelbase works with. The motor controller and encoder work together and determine where the rotor is, where it's going, and where it actually needs to be. Now whatever we have talked about so far makes up what we call is a closed loop system. The game sends torque command to the firmware, which passes it to the motor controller. The rotor spins, the encoder measures its exact position and reports it back to the microcontroller. And this loop repeats thousands of times per second. But here's the interesting bit. The firmware receives two key pieces of information. First is the desired torque from the game, and second is the actual rotor position measured by the encoder. Basically what's happening is, the game says give me 6 Newton meters of torque right now. The firmware receives the command, calculates the required amount of current to achieve it, sends it to the motor, the encoder reports back with the position. Now based on that, the firmware sees that the motor did not exactly move the way it was supposed to. So now you see there is a bit of a deviation. Now why it happens? Simply put, this is an electrical motor. Any sort of deviations are 100% normal. Not only is it normal, it is inevitable. No matter how advanced the system is, there will be deviations. Aside from you feeding it current, you, as the user, have no control over what it actually does. And based on the current it is receiving, it will either undershoot or overshoot. Now, if it continues to work in that manner, the force feedback will feel very random and off. And you don't want that. What you want is to feel the car at Eau Rouge, not have your wrist snapped in half. Now, to make sure that none of that ever happens and this entire loop keeps on working in as effective of a manner as possible, control algorithm comes into play. What is a control algorithm, you may ask? It is nothing but a system designed to fix the error between desired value and actual response. There are many different types of control algorithms, but you only need to know about two of them, PID and FOC. PID checks the error, the difference between what should happen and what is happening, and constantly adjusts to fix it. Proportional reacts to what is wrong right now. Integral fix what's been wrong for a while. Derivative predicts what might go wrong next and smoothen things out. Together, they are always working to close the gap between desired torque and actual response. But the process can sometimes feel rigid, a bit snappy, and at times unrefined. FOC, on the other hand, does things a bit differently. Instead of constantly correcting errors like PID, it aligns the magnetic fields inside the motor perfectly. It reads the rotor's position in real time and controls the current phase and magnitude precisely. So the motor always moves in the most efficient manner. Both can be tuned to feel good, but when the hardware and implementation are equal, FOC usually comes out ahead. It's more efficient, more accurate, and the reason why it is being used on most high-end direct drive wheelbases. With that covered, let's get back to the system correcting itself. Once the control algorithm finishes its job, which is to close the gap between desired torque and actual response, the system knows exactly how much current needs to be sent to each motor phase to generate the required torque. The data is passed along to the motor driver, which, like I mentioned before, handles the actual power delivery. This is where the previously calculated current values are turned into real, physical motion by sending them directly into the motor's three-phase winding. And after all the stuff which I explained in the last few minutes, the motor spins again, correctly this time. And this is the stage which you feel. If you're confused here, let me put your mind at ease. Yes, the loop always starts with a bit of deviation. The motor reacts, the encoder measures the result, and the control algorithm quickly fixes it. But all of this does not happen in separate steps. You see, it's not like the motor is spinning, it is stopping for correction, the correction happens, and then it spins again. No. The motor continuously spins while all of this is happening, including the correction. And it updates itself thousands of times in 1 second. All of this happens so fast that you never feel the error. What you feel is the end result of the system. With FOC, it is usually a little bit nicer, smoother and refined. With PID, it's a bit punchy. And this is what happens in those 0.1 milliseconds. Now the story is kind of complete, but there is one last piece that you should be aware of: thermal management, because all of this is obviously going to heat up the system. The firmware constantly monitors temperature of the motor, the MOSFET and the entire PCB. If things get too hot, active cooling kicks in, if there is a fan. On passive cooling basis, it is cooled by external factors. But if the temperature still climbs, torque gets reduced. In some extreme cases, it will shut itself down as a protective measure. But high-end bases don't usually require fan. Their cases or the motor enclosure itself acts as a massive heat sink designed for passive cooling. And yet, people touch the surface and go, "Oh, it's too hot," without even realizing what this poor thing has been doing to entertain you. So the next time it gets warm, maybe try complimenting it a little. Okay, jokes aside, all of this, from input to output to thermal management, happens in milliseconds. No one notices the math or the current. You feel it. The weight of the car shifting, the tires gripping the road, the rear slipping out, and without even thinking, you react. Your reflexes kick in. But the reflexes are a whole different topic, and I'm not covering that. Unless you want me to. That's been it. I've been the Nap Man, and may the downforce be with you.